Well, welcome to another of our discussion summaries on the revised social principles of the United Methodist Church. Today we're going to talk about creation in peril, which appears on pages 9 and 10 in the document that has been shared of those revised social principles. So the creation in peril section starts by acknowledging that unsustainable human activities have placed the entirety of God's creation in peril. I think that's a bit of an overstatement. We're actually talking about placing the earth in peril. We have yet to place other planets in peril yet. Further, we confess that the degradation and wholesale destruction of the natural environment threatens unprecedented harm, bringing danger to human and non-human life alike. So in many ways, this opening section is a confessional statement that acknowledges that human activities have at times put the earth and humans and non-human life alike in danger. It begins with the destruction of ecosystems and that conversation. And I'm going to actually read a couple sections of this, or the whole section of this one, just so that you can hear it. Whether human beings are conscious of it or not, we are participants in and beneficiaries of complex natural ecosystems made up of myriads of symbiotic relationships between living organisms, such as animals, plants, insects, and microorganisms, in the physical environments they inhabit, including air, water, and soil. Overconsumption, short-sighted policies, poor management of resources, and other unsustainable practices have severely impacted the fragile natural ecosystems on which all of life depends. Too often, humankind has treated the rest of the created world as if it were disposable, and allowed the destruction of other living organisms and their natural habitats to go unchecked. Further, the experiences and voices of people most at risk have largely been ignored. So we began our discussion with the very experiential side of things. When have you experienced damage or destruction to ecosystems? And conversations were just some of them that were brought up were things like seeing an area where a very large production facility had been put in, and how all of the ecosystem around there was scraped off and left in big piles of dirt off to the side. There were these huge areas that are sometimes cleared for industrial activities, to the witnessing of an area following a forest fire where all that was left over was just sticks and trees, and there was no scrub or anything, just a large burnt area. To myself, I have visited an area that has been strip mined, and 20 years later, seeing the devastation of that area, where still there is no growth of even small trees, and how that area has been affected in the long term. And then also, because I do enjoy doing fossil hunting, the areas of where there have been quarries and how that affects the ecosystem for a very long time. That again, it's kind of mining for stone or gravel, and how those affect the ecosystems. Trying to think and remember others, but essentially, one mentioned war and how that has destroyed just. If you've had the experience of being in a war, that is devastating to the ecosystem on a whole different way, and was one I hadn't even thought of when I was thinking about destruction of ecosystems. We then went to the question of what do you think is the biblical response to that destruction, and it was pretty clear that we don't think that that's something that God wants, and that God does hold us responsible for how we have treated the earth and nature. And then how do we ourselves try to live in ways that uh, don't encourage that? That was a harder question, and one that we struggled with throughout all of the questions for today, because quite honestly, the problems feel very big and often beyond our ability to answer and handle. We do see some hope, though, and I hopefully will get to that as we go along as well. I talked a bit about how some of our religious approaches to the environment have contributed to our unwillingness to see ourselves as part of the ecosystem. So, one of the people talked specifically about how there's this sense that we are spirit and not physical sometimes in the way religions impact talk about things, and so then we're separate. We're human beings. We're not part of the ecosystem, and realizing that that has been an unhelpful way of viewing creation. Another that the sort of idea that God will fix it when the end is here and we don't have to worry about it. I really liked how one person said, compared that to their children saying, well, we're just going to move in a couple weeks anyway, so I don't have to clean my room. Trying to throw off responsibility because God's going to fix it. Theologically, that may not be the best approach, because there certainly are ways that biblically suggest that God is going to complete creation, not do away with it. And so there's this idea that what we do with the earth does matter, because it is part of what God envisions as the completion. And so we can't just say, oh, we're going to move in 2 weeks. I don't need to clean my room. We do, in fact, need to keep that up. And that was a wonderful little insight in comparison to how we care for creation. This statement has a couple of things that remind us that we are indeed part of the ecosystem, and reminds us that it is not disposable. It also talks about the reminder that there are people who have the experiences and voices of people who have been ignored. In other words, that there are places in the world where the environmental impacts are more severe, where destruction of ecosystems has impacted them more severely. And to be aware that we need to listen to some of those as they speak about what's happening in their parts of the world. So then we got, that one was relatively uncomplicated, and people pretty much all had experienced times when humans have done destruction, have been destructive of the world around. Things now get a little more where our opinions diverged a bit as we go into global warming and climate change. So the statement from the United Methodist Church is very clear about acceptance of global warming and climate change and human impact upon that through industrialization and deforestation. But I knew going in that not everyone would necessarily agree with that statement. So we talked about and just asked and gave everyone the opportunity to talk about, what impact do you believe greenhouse gases have upon the environment and why? And we had people that talked about everything from seeing how things have changed over the years and believing that greenhouse gases have impacted the environment, to others who said that they didn't really see any changes in the environment and things still seemed to be basically the same as they always were. And so they doubted the impact of greenhouse gases. To people, one of our younger individuals who in school was taught about greenhouse gases and how those do affect the environment and why they believed that that was true, to my own experience of having worked with some computer modeling of different environmental effects, particularly gases in planetary systems, and how those affect heat retention in. Yeah, you didn't know I did astronomy for a while, right? How those have impacted planetary systems. And so I see that as something very real. So we had people that experienced this sense of greenhouse gases as something that was a danger to those who didn't. One of the discussions that was very much real was how some people didn't like the statements of in 10 years we'll be here, or feeling like things were being over dramatized, or that the sense of urgency was being amplified to a point where it wasn't helpful. We did talk about how people are very seldom motivated by threats. In fact, people have a tendency to resist such things. And so admitting within ourselves that sometimes that threatening language actually serves to harm the message. Lots and lots of different places that this discussion went. Again, not at all an agreement. So if you're hoping for a unanimous discussion on this one, there was not. I then did lead us into a couple of other similar statements, just to, once in a while I wanted us to compare some statements from different traditions. So the first one is a quote from the Papal Encyclical Laudato Si, the first chapter. It's many, many pages, in paragraphs 60 and 61. Finally, we need to acknowledge that different approaches and lines of thought have emerged regarding this situation and its possible solutions. At one extreme, we find those who doggedly uphold the myth of progress that tells us that ecological problems will solve themselves simply with the application of new technology and without any need for ethical considerations or deep change. At the other extreme are those who view men and women in all their interventions as no more than a threat, jeopardizing the global ecosystem, and consequently the presence of human beings on the planet should be reduced, and all forms of intervention prohibited. Viable future scenarios will have to be generated between these two extremes. So the Pope Francis is rejecting the extremes and saying that there's not one path to the solution. This makes a variety of proposals possible, all capable of entering into dialogue with a view of developing comprehensive solutions. We did kind of talk about those extremes, the idea that, well, we don't have to do anything about it, it will fix itself, versus the idea that we just need to get rid of a whole bunch of people and then we'll be okay. Who's going to decide that one is a huge question, obviously. So the extremes definitely weren't within our scope of ideas. And then paragraph 61 of the papal statement says, on many concrete questions, the Church has no reason to offer definitive opinion. She knows that honest debate must be encouraged among experts while respecting divergent views. But we need only take a frank look at the facts to see that our common home is falling into serious disrepair. Hope would have us recognize that there is always a way out, that we can always redirect our steps, that we can always do something to solve our problems. So that hanging on to hope. Still, we can see signs that things are now reaching a breaking point due to the rapid pace of change and degradation. These are evident in large-scale natural disasters as well as social and even financial crises, for the world's problems cannot be analyzed or explained in isolation. There are regions now at high risk, and aside from all doomsday predictions, the present world system is certainly unsustainable from a number of points of view. For we have stopped thinking about the goals of human activity. And I loved that statement. We actually came back to that several times in our discussion about what is the goal of human activity? What are we about? And that makes us change. If we spend a little bit of time thinking about that and how we're supposed to live, that might change how we use resources or how we view environmental issues. If we scan the regions of our planet, we can immediately see that humanity has disappointed God's expectations. And then another statement by the Islamic Climate Change Declaration, which I have to admit I find interesting, although it is a bit of a stereotype to say that Islam is from the Middle East. There certainly is a large portion of Islam that is from the Middle East. Islam also has huge populations in Indonesia and Pakistan and some other places that are not oil producing. But it's interesting to see that this Islamic Climate Change Declaration, where many of those with a lot of influence in Islam have had money come from oil, this is a very direct statement about changing our patterns of living. So from Section 3.3 of the Islamic Climate Change Declaration, it says, we call on the people of all nations and their leaders to aim to phase out greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible in order to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, commit themselves to 100% renewable energy and or zero emissions strategy as early as possible to mitigate the environmental impact of their activities, invest in decentralized renewable energy, which is the best way to reduce poverty and achieve sustainable development, to realize that the chase after unlimited economic growth on a planet that is finite and already overloaded is not viable. Growth must be pursued wisely and in moderation, placing a priority on increasing the resilience of all, and especially the most vulnerable, to the climate change impacts already underway and expected to continue for many years to come. Set in motion a fresh model of well-being based on an alternative to the current financial model, which depletes resources, degrades the environment, and deepens inequality. Prioritize adaptation efforts with appropriate support to the vulnerable countries with the least capacity to adapt, and to vulnerable groups, including indigenous peoples, women, and children. Whew. And I know that's a lot of reading and a lot to hear, but we then compared the statements from the Pope, from the United Methodist Church, and from Islamic leaders, and what are some of the common themes. Some of the common themes are that we as human beings do have impact. We as human beings do have the responsibility to react and make changes. We as human beings need to be aware of those who are impacted more than others, particularly those that their voices or their places they live may not have the power or the money to influence discussions. And we talked about all of those kinds of things. We also talked about how they all have a sense of urgency and call us to action to do some things. Again, one of the discussions that came about was the feeling that this is all too big, and there's some hopelessness that some of our members felt around this. It's more than we can change. And again, of course, there's the whether or not this is really our fault or is just something that's part of the natural world. All kinds of different perspectives here, but realizing that there is a common theme and a call here for us to be responsible for what we should be responsible for, and being aware of the issues and how we are participants in them, and how we can think about changing our lives. And then we had a combination, one person who said, well, I'm not going to change how I'm living. I've lived this way for a long time. But we also had the statement from a young person about how they're seeing hope that in the research that is being done, particularly in nuclear fusion, for a possibility of a clean fuel source. So then we moved into kind of the next one, which is our dependence on fossil fuels. And this statement is pretty strong about fossil fuels, but it also talks about the alternatives having some dangers. Reliance on nuclear energy raises concerns about safe storage and containment. Some of our people talked about some of the dangers of wind energy and the concern about noise and the concern about effect to birds. Always things that get brought up when we talk about different types of energy. And again, our young person talking about the hope that maybe there will be some improvement in forms of energy that have less impact. And so where I tried to steer our conversation then was energy as we know it always has advantages and disadvantages, and it has ways and places it does harm and ways it does good. And so coming back to those concepts of Wesley of doing no harm, doing good, and how we weigh what energy sources and energy uses do good and do harm, and how do we weigh those impacts on individuals and communities around the world? How do we do that fairly? And again, these aren't easy questions, but to be aware and to be asking ourselves as we look at these things, what is the harm that this does? Does the harm outweigh the good? What is the good that this does? And are there methods or energy sources that have less downsides and more upsides? And how do we seek to limit that harm? We also got into a really good discussion about the sections in these that talk about retraining. There's a section in the alternative fuel dependence on fossil fuel section that talks about the impact on individuals and communities whose livelihoods are dependent on the production, sale, and distribution of fossil fuels, and how retraining is necessary, and how that's often complicated by families wanting to stay in the areas they're living in, but also talking about how there's possibilities for jobs in things like the arts, things like new farming methods that can be done in some of those areas, hydroponics, ways that people are rebuilding lives. And so the encouragement is that people will be impacted by any change that happens, but how can we begin to help people find new ways of having life? It was overall, although we certainly didn't all agree on certain things, we all also do understand that part of what we are about as human beings is living our life in a way that is responding to God's call for us. What does God want us to do? That question from the papal statement kind of reverberated a couple times. What is the goal? What is God's goal for human activity? I mean, clearly part of it is for us to come to understand God, and we talked about that, and to convey God's love. One of the things we didn't talk about, but I think I would add to that, is I think it's vitally important part of our life is to be about living in connection with each other and community with each other and with what we've been given. So stewardship, which is going to be our next section. We're going to be next week talking about the stewardship of creation and how we have been given these things, and God has asked us to oversee them well and to care for them. And that perhaps even if we disagree about some of the specifics about greenhouse gases and those impacts, we still know that God has called us to care for all that we've been given and to use it faithfully and not wastefully. And so perhaps we need to, again, we may not always agree on how that's to be done and what ways that's to be done, but to remind ourselves that at the baseline, what we're about is indeed being faithful with what we've been given. Lots of good conversation, and I thank you for taking time to listen and to watch and to think about how the creation that we have been given by God, how we have had negative impacts upon it, and how we might consider changing and living in ways that are more in harmony and balance. So have yourselves a very blessed day, and bye now.